Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait about 2 to 3 minutes and see if anybody else joins. We had a lot more on the registration list, so we'll give it a couple minutes and we'll get started shortly. For those of you that just joined, we're just going to be waiting a couple more minutes here to see if anybody else pops in before we get started. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Today, the webinar is going to be about automating employee request approvals in Microsoft 365, really talking about how we can turn form submissions into tracked multi-stage approvals. We did a webinar series on this, or episode on this earlier in the year. This one is going to build off of that, talk a little bit more about the options we have with forms, and go into some more complicated workflow possibilities. My name is Zach Welding. I am the Senior M365 Solutions Architect and Developer, and I have on the call with me Dave Kleist, who is our Operations Director as well. So what are we going to talk about today? A little bit about why manual employee request processes break down, what are some of the inefficiencies we see with that, and how can we make it better. We're going to talk about the different options we have with forms in Microsoft 365 and how SharePoint can help be treated as like the request record and database for all of our form submissions. We're going to go over a specific example that one of our clients has used with how they submit, gather, and approve flexible work schedule requests. And we'll talk about the Power Automate approval process that was built to handle all of the different scenarios that could potentially happen during that submission, and kind of go over some of the notifications, reporting, and then again, how can you reuse this for your types of business scenarios? So why are manual employee processes broken and difficult to manage? Well, they're hard to track, first of all, right? If you don't have a formal form that you can fill out and a documented process for where this form goes, it's likely just going to get printed off and slapped on somebody's desk or sent as an attachment via email. And from there, it's hard to track, right? It gets buried in an inbox. Where's the actual status update? It probably lives in somebody's brain, or somebody marked it as a to-do in their own Outlook. Nobody else can see that. Approval-wise, again, like how are you going to send reminders? Who's going to know where it's at in the process? And then once something's done, where does that artifact go? Does it rely on somebody manually to upload it to an employee folder? Do you have to go back and look at an email chain to see what somebody said in email? What if you've got 40 of those that you need to review and audit? An email inbox is going to be virtually impossible to do that with. So by using Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Forms, and Power Automate, you can turn that messy request into a consistent and trackable workflow. So how do you get the data? We need to make a form. And when we say form, we don't mean using a Word document or a PDF form. We're really talking about 3 different options. Microsoft Forms, SharePoint lists, and Power Apps. Before you even get to deciding what type of form you're going to use, you need to have a place for that to be available to users. So if you guys have an intranet, great place for this to go. You can either have a forms page that's for your entire organization as a whole, where all of your fillable forms live. I've seen that. I've also seen them segregated based on department. So every department landing page might have a little corner in there on their website that's got, you know, fillable forms and all the different forms that pertain to that department live there. And the important piece is that we make sure we capture all of the different data up front. We don't want to have to go back to the user and ask for data later on in the process. So being able to identify what fields are absolutely necessary and required for the approval process to work and setting the forms accordingly. So as I mentioned, really 3 options, and these are listed in terms of simplicity to more complex. Microsoft Forms, great and easy tool to spin up a form really quickly. Typically it's best for, you know, one and done type situations where you don't need to go back and look at something, run a process off of. You just need to get the data one time and you're good. Forms is usually the place to do that. When you create a form, it needs to live under your account or under a group account. So we see a lot of times where people create these forms to run a business process under their user. That user then leaves. Now the form is dead because the form was built and lives under that user account. So if you are going to use forms, I would highly encourage you to put them into a group. That way the group owns the form and nothing's going to get turned off or become stuck or stale if an employee leaves. SharePoint lists. So if you guys have scenarios where we're going to be running a process like what we're going to be talking about during today's webinar, SharePoint lists are a great place to store the data. It gives you flexibility to create different views for different people that might be looking at the data. Also, it's like a spreadsheet on steroids, right? You got everything in rows and columns, and you can sort and filter as needed. Power Apps would be the third option. That would be if you need a form that is highly customized. Maybe you need it branded a certain way. Maybe you need certain sections of the form. If you have any dollar amount fields that maybe you need to total up into a field at the end and you don't want the user to have to add those up manually, Power Apps, you can write formulas to do all of that. So I'll share my screen here and just go over some of the different options you have and what each one can look like. And I'll be using our flexible work request form as an example. So here's an example of the form that we're using in this process. This was built a couple years ago before the option to use Microsoft Forms was integrated to SharePoint lists. So at the time, this was our only option. But even today, when that option still exists, we would have still picked this option because of a design requirement. So the unique thing with this is that we wanted to be able to use different sections and force the employee to click through each section to read all the text. The section architecture or functionality is not available when customizing SharePoint lists with Microsoft Forms. We'll go over that in just a second here, but ultimately that was the decision that made it, yes, this is why we need to use Microsoft Forms. So we have all these different sections created with text. There's no questions yet. This forces the user to click through each one individually. Once you get to the final screen, we have an acknowledgement that says, yes, I've read it and ready to fill out, and it'll present the rest of the fields. If they choose no, it doesn't really give them any options other than to submit a blank form. Once we get into the automation process a little bit later on, these fields will come into play. So these are some optional fields that we added to provide more flexibility for the user. We had cases where managers were out on leave, on vacation, and things weren't getting approved in time. So if the user knows that their manager is going to be out of the office, we provided them a field to fill in the email of a backup manager. The automation then uses conditional rules to evaluate that, which we'll look at later. Another one here, do you want to submit the same as last time? So again, the workflow is going to need to see the value of each of these fields every time this is submitted, and no matter what's chosen, it's going to go down a different path. So if I said no, now I've got the rest of the form that I can fill out. I can go through, fill out all the fields. I've got more fields. And here's another fork in the road, so to speak. So depending on how I answer this, the workflow that we show later is going to go down a different path. So if I say, yes, I'm requiring an exception, now it's going to ask me for all that exception detail. If I would have said no, now it's just going to ask me to submit. So some of those fields will come into play a little bit later, and we'll talk about those when we get to the workflow piece. So like I said, we chose forms here. Ultimately, though, we have a combination of the two. The workflow is actually creating an item in SharePoint so that we can track these things. So here's the list in SharePoint. And again, why is this better than forms? We can create views here to sort and filter things out. So they've been using the same form for 3 years now. Every year, there's a different submission range. So we can go back and see all of the submission ranges from 2 years ago, all of them from 1 year ago. All of them have approval details that are listed in here. And again, all of these fields are sortable, filterable, searchable. It lets everybody in HR look at the data in a way that makes sense to them. The third option of forms would be Power Apps. So if the default form like this that you get with SharePoint isn't good enough, and you don't want to use Microsoft Forms, here's the other button that I forgot to mention. So this did not exist maybe 6 months ago. It didn't exist. This lets you use Microsoft Forms technology right in the list. And like I said before, as far as I'm aware, I think the only thing that you can't do is sections. So very similar to the Microsoft Forms look and feel. It still has branching. So if I want to say, hey, if they answered no to this, then skip that question and go to the next one, still has branching. It just doesn't have the section functionality, which is what they ultimately needed for this form. So this is another option that you could use. I would always start with a SharePoint list as the back end, unless, like I said, it's just a one and done type of survey thing. So the last option, Power Apps, that's accessible through the Integrate tab. Customize forms. What that does is it'll open up the Power Automate or the Power Apps editing experience. It'll automatically set up all the data connections, all of the form functionality to submit, and then you have the ability to customize like the order of the fields, the size of the fields, and from there you can add in more functionality with custom formulas and expressions to show things based on how other fields were entered in there. All right, back to PowerPoint. So in our example today, the full process of the flow, it all starts with an employee submitting a request. So as I mentioned before, really important to provide a reliable place for the user to find that. In your old way of doing things, it might have been a template Word file living out in a file share. They've got to open that up, fill it out, save it locally to their computer, and then do something with it. Maybe email it, maybe upload it somewhere else. Lots of user steps. So by using a solution such as this, there's a form that's easily findable, easily fillable, and easily submitted. There's no jumping from platform to platform. It's all in one spot. We're also using a SharePoint list, as I showed, to capture all of the submitted data. We're using Power Automate for our automated approvals section to route the request to the appropriate people. That approval process uses actions to send emails. It can send Teams notifications. And then the auditing and reporting ultimately comes back to the SharePoint list. All of that data throughout the approval process at the very end is written back to the SharePoint list item for long-term record keeping. So how does the Power Automate approval work? We'll run through these steps really quick, and then I will actually demonstrate the actual flow in how it looks. So just the basics of Power Automate. Everything always needs to have a trigger. That trigger can be anything from when a new form response is submitted in Forms, to when a new document is added in a folder, to when a new email arrives in my inbox. You can create filters to look for certain subject lines. And then things can also be manually triggered. So the previous webinar that we did on policies and procedures, that utilized a manual trigger. If you guys watched that one, they were editing documents in place, and when they were ready to submit them for approval, they would have to click a button that would submit it for approval. So that's an example of a user-generated trigger. Flows can also run on a schedule. So maybe there is a scenario where you need to constantly check something, or once a day, once a week, once a month, any type of iteration like that, you need to do something. The trigger would be a scheduled flow in that case. From there, you need to evaluate. Different rules, conditions are built into the flow process to react differently based on the data that it has. So we'll get into that example shortly here. Approvals. So in this case, there's going to be 3 levels of approval. It's going to go to the manager no matter what. After that, if the manager approves it, depending on whether or not it was an exception, if you remember that field, if an exception was chosen and the manager approved it, then it's going to go to the department head. There is some more logic in there that says if the department head is the same as the manager, there's no sense in making them approve it twice. So we'll skip it. And then after that, it goes to the HR director. So lots of approvals built in there. Updates. So as the workflow is going, it's updating variables as it goes with all of the current information and information from each approval step, which is then written back to SharePoint. And then at the very end, people are notified, whether it's the submitter, the HR, everybody that was involved in the process is notified when the process is done with what the outcome was. So I will flip over to Power Automate again. And we will take a look at the basics of how this works. So this is the old school design of Power Automate. I'm still not on board with the new designer. If anybody has used it, I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts in the chat window, which one you guys use, whether it's the new one or the old one. The new one just seems a little bit more cumbersome to try and find like dynamic content and stuff. And I just haven't given it the time to really get used to it. So we're going to be looking at this in the old designer. So here's our trigger. The trigger is always the first one listed at the top. So when a new response is submitted, there's the ID of my form. I'm getting the response details of that form. That's all the data that was submitted. And I'm setting a whole bunch of variables. So this is a pretty complex workflow. You can see there's variables in here for reminder counts, whether or not approvals are complete. So we've got some logic built in to check whether or not it's done to send reminders. We're storing department head emails, IDs for items that get created, all sorts of stuff. So once the variables are done, we're getting the user's profile. That's so that we can find out who their manager is based off of Azure AD. If it's the same, well, actually, I should say, if they chose to fill out that optional field with another manager, we're going to set the manager variable to whatever they put in. If they didn't, meaning they left it blank, we're going to go ahead and use the manager that it finds using the get manager option. Next thing we're doing is we're checking to see if they're requesting the same as last year. So remember I said that the forms is not natively connected to SharePoint lists, and the automation is actually what created the list item in SharePoint. So we need to know, hey, are we creating a new item with the data from the form? Or if they selected the same as last time, we didn't ask them for any information. So at that point, I need to go back to the list that we have in SharePoint and find their item from last year and then recreate it with this year's timestamp. So that's what we're doing here. We're going back, we're getting the items. We've got some filter criteria listed here. And then ultimately we're using what we find to create a new item with the proper time frame. After that, we're looking to see if they requested an exception, which was more than 40%. And we're setting a whole bunch of variables here based on that, because if you remember, the form asked for more information. So as we get further on down into the approvals, when we send the approval, we tried not to send approvals with information that didn't exist. So in order to do that, you use a variable that you set depending on what path you go down, and you use that variable in the approval so that you're not just sending a bunch of blank information across. So the other side of that, if they are not requesting the same, then we're just going to simply create a new item with all the information that they submitted through the form. And then same thing again, 40%, we're setting a bunch of variables. So we did all that before we even created an approval. Here's the first approval step with the manager. So you can see there's the request details. That's the variable that is set up above based on how they filled out the form. Once the approval is created, this is not built in. There's no automatic reminders, which is unfortunate. You'd think that as sophisticated as this tool is, that there would be a checkbox or something built in to the approvals action for reminders, but there is not. So that has to be manually configured. And you do that in a do until action. Essentially, it's a loop. So we're saying do this until the approval complete variable is equal to yes. So I'm going to wait for this approval to be complete, which is that one. If it does get completed, I'm going to set my variable to yes, and then I'm going to go ahead and capture all the response data, the comments, who approved it, when they approved it, and set some variables there. I have this set to timeout every day. So if this times out, now this is going to be sent to the manager. Hey, you got to complete this. And then it's going to get to the bottom of the loop and it's going to start over again. So every day, the manager is getting a reminder email to complete these. And the reason for that is that any flow has a maximum runtime of 30 days. That's a Microsoft hard limit. You got to create a daisy chain of workflows in order to get around that maximum time limit. So we chose to be kind of aggressive here and send reminders daily for them to complete that. Once that's done, I got to revert that variable back to no so that the next time I come to an approval, we can use the same thing. So here we're checking again to make sure that, was 40% more being requested? Because if it was, we need to get more approvals because that requires multiple stages of approval. If it's not, then I'm checking to see if it's approved. If it was, I'm going to create a final PDF version of this and then send an email with an attachment letting them know that it was completed. We do have one incomplete step in this workflow process. We will be, actually, am I doing it right here? Yes, we are doing it. We had that in there. So rather than just sending the email and saying, hey, here's the final PDF, go do something with it, we're actually creating the PDF in the employee's personnel file in the HR file share. So that's what this step is doing. So it completely eliminated all of the manual steps from an administrative standpoint. Going down the other side, this is where we evaluate, hey, is the manager the same as the department head? If yes, don't do an approval. If they're different, okay, now we need the department head approval process. Exact same process as the manager. We're creating approval. We're waiting for it to be complete. We're sending reminders, and we're evaluating whether or not it was approved. If it was not, here's our denied email that we send out. If it was approved, now we're going on to the final approval to the city manager and HR director, and we're evaluating, all the way down to the bottom. At the very end, we go back and update the item with all of the approval information, gets appended to a string as it's going. And if you can, let's see, so gets thrown back into an approval details, tells you who did it, what their outcome was, any comments they put in, and then the final outcome. So if it goes through all three different approvals, you're going to have all of them listed there. All right, we'll hop back to the PowerPoint here. So as you saw, using SharePoint lists and automated approvals helps keep people informed, and it reduces manual follow-up. If somebody in HR wants to say, hey, did that request ever get approved? They don't need to send an email to the team and ask somebody else to go look through their inbox and find out whether or not it was approved. They can go to the list themselves, see what the status is, and if it's done or rejected, all the information is right there. It improves visibility. Everybody can see that, and ultimately helps reduce bottlenecks and makes sure that everything actually goes through the same process. If you're relying on a process like this to be manual, pretty easy for something to get lost in the cracks, or not get forwarded on, or maybe only get approved once, or somebody doesn't hit reply all. It's hard to track. So puts everything in a completely reliable process. So kind of to summarize everything, this is just one example of how you can use Microsoft 365. Like I said, this is our second episode kind of talking about this, but the same approach can be applied to PTO, policy exceptions, purchase requests, onboarding, department intake, all sorts of stuff. Anytime you have a process where you're gathering data and then something needs to happen, this process can be applied. So it gives you a centralized place to track, reliable and consistent approvals, and then automatic communication and an audit trail. So really the full package of what you would need to push out a fully automated process. If you guys have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A. We'll give it a minute here to see if anybody's typing in there. Otherwise, if you guys think that you have a process and are curious if it would be a good fit, or you have some more additional questions that you don't want to type out in here, my email, Dave's email, our sales phone number is listed here. Feel free to reach out. Yes, this will be shared. We need about a day or two to polish a couple things up on it, and then everything gets posted to our YouTube channel. So we can send out an email once everything is uploaded on there, and then you guys can continue to use that moving forward. And if you haven't attended all these webinars, feel free to go back and watch. They should all be uploaded there too. Doesn't look like anything's being thrown in the Q&A. Nobody else is typing in chat. Oh, maybe we got some. What is the YouTube channel? Let me get that, and I will put it in the chat window here. How can we move forms created from the user to the group? Great question. So there is an option when you are in forms. You guys should be seeing my screen. So you can see all these different forms here. They're all tied to groups. If you have one that's for your part of your user, I'll create one really quick here. The one thing I would be aware of, or I'm not completely positive if it happens or not. I guess we could verify when we do this. So this is the ID that you're going to use in Power Automate when you're selecting it. I don't know if that changes when you move something. So here's our form. I'm going to copy that over on my other screen here, and then we'll go back to form. So there's my test. It's owned by me. It's pretty simple. You have to be a member of the group, not an owner. I don't know what Microsoft, they must have used the wrong container to verify against, but when you come in here and say move to a group, it's only going to show you groups that you're a member of. So if you're an owner of a group and not a member, it's not going to show up here. Just add yourself as a member as well, and then it should show up. And then it's just as easy as clicking it and click and move. Like I said, I don't know if the ID stays the same. So if you have an automation tied to it, it'd be worth giving it a couple minutes after you move it, going into Power Automate and making sure that the IDs are the same. Does it give you an option to be owner and member? Through the admin portal, you should be able to add yourself as a owner and member. Yeah. I don't know if it'll let you do it if you're doing it from like the SharePoint site. But I know from like the Microsoft 365 admin center, you can add somebody twice as an owner and member. That moves the form, but not the 365 connections in place. Yeah, any connections that you used in the workflow, those are completely independent of where the form lives. Which brings up a good point that I didn't mention during the talk there. I would recommend that you guys use service accounts for these things. If you're creating a workflow and you're using your own account for all the different connections, it's no different than you being the owner for the form. If you end up leaving, your account gets shut off, all your workflows that you created using your account are not going to work either. So usually recommend creating like a Power Automate account that's a service account that can be kept in place long term and use that to create all the connections. All right, I don't see anybody else typing in there. So with that, thanks again for joining. We'll get the webinar uploaded to YouTube within the next couple of days, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.